Do you want to learn how to use shiny Pokemon in your renders? Do you want to give your Pokemon more personality by changing their facial expression? Maybe even fix some strange eye issues? If so, then this video is for you. Hello everyone, glad to have you here. Today, I'm going to show you how to use the Pokemon textures provided with your models efficiently, and how you can overcome some texture-based roadblocks that you might run into. If you haven't seen my previous tutorial on importing and rendering Pokemon models in Blender, then I highly recommend you check out that video first. This tutorial will assume that you already have basic knowledge on navigating the software, importing Pokemon models, creating a render setup, and any information that I previously stated in that video. So keep that in mind. But with that aside, let's get started. When we last left off, we rendered this neat image using an Eevee model, a modified plane, and some point lamps, with our final setup looking something like this. What we made was certainly a finished product, but what if we wanted to do something more with it? Say, turn our normal Eevee into a shiny Eevee. Luckily, this is incredibly easy to do, so let's get to it. First off, I'm going to select our background plane and press the H key to hide it, just so it doesn't distract us while we're working with the model's textures. For a similar reason, I'll be selecting Eevee's armature and hiding it as well. Now we can give our full attention to the model and how it looks. In order to adjust a model's textures, we need to open up a new type of editor, specifically the shader editor. So go up to this button in the top left corner of our rightmost window and select Shader Editor. This will replace our camera view, but we won't need to look out of our camera for a while, so this is fine. Now you may notice that the shader editor is looking quite blank right now. That is because we haven't told Blender what material we want to edit for our model. As a matter of fact, we haven't even specified what model we're working with right now, as the Eevee model is currently unselected in the viewport. Select the Eevee model, and you should see some boxes, or nodes, pop up in the shader editor. Each of these nodes play a specific role in dictating the model's appearance, but I will go over their individual functions as it becomes necessary. For now, we need to see what material these nodes are assigned to, so let's go over to the material properties. It looks like our mouth material is what's currently selected in our material list, so the nodes we are seeing in the shader editor right now are dictating the appearance of the mouth material. Every material has its own independent set of nodes, so before you do anything in the shader editor, you'll want to be attentive to what material you have selected in the material list. Whatever you have selected here is the part of Eevee's body you will be adjusting using the shader editor, so don't forget to double check the material list. Anyway, using both the shader editor and the material list, we can change Eevee's textures to that of its shiny variant. Let's start off by changing Eevee's main body, so select Eevee's body material from the list. We aren't going to need these ambient, specular, or reflective nodes in our setup, so I'm going to enable box select using the B key, drag a box over these three nodes, and press the X key to delete them. Let's now bring our attention to this base color node, or as it's formally called, an image texture node. This does what you might expect. It applies an image texture to the material, and the material then applies that texture to the model based on various specifications, like the model's UV mapping. Using this folder icon here, we can change the image texture that the material will apply to the model. Before we click that though, let's extend this node and take a look at what the name of the texture currently applied to the material is. This name, particularly the later characters, will be important in selecting the right texture later on. So write this down or keep it in your mind. With that out of the way, let's select the folder icon. This will bring us to a file menu that looks very similar to the import menu that I showed in the previous tutorial. Where you'll want to go might depend on how you structured your folders and where you place them on your computer, but for me, I'm going to go to my desktop, Pokemon Models, Gen 1, Eevee, and instead of entering the normal image folder, I'm going to go to the image shiny folder. This will bring us to the model's shiny textures, which typically hold the exact same names as their normal counterparts. With that in mind, you'll want to remember the name of the texture that was in your image texture node before we entered this file menu, and select the same texture here. If you don't remember the exact name, typically the texture you'll want to select has a 1 at the end of its name, with no characters after it aside from .png. If you're using a Sword and Shield model, the texture will also have the word rare listed at the end of its name. Now that that's selected, let's open it. Voila! Eevee now looks like its shiny variant. However, the eyes and mouth still need to be swapped, so let's take care of that. Select the eye material from the list, delete these 3 nodes, and zoom in on our image texture node. Remember to extend this node so you know the exact texture that you're looking for, in this case the eye texture, and then click the folder icon. Now it may look like we're already back in the shiny folder, but keep in mind that both the normal and shiny textures share the same name, and that Blender will usually start us off in the location of the texture currently in use. So in reality, this is just the normal image folder. We can confirm this by looking at this file path up here, with the last characters on the path clearly showing that we are in the normal image folder. We can use this file path to take a bit of a shortcut though. If we select this path and delete the image part out of it, and click outside the box to confirm, Blender will backstep us to the Eevee folder. And from here, we can select the image shiny folder without having to navigate through all of our computer's files again. You can also go to your recents panel and select the folder from there. Now that we're back in the shiny folder, select the corresponding eye texture and open it. We're almost there. All we need to do is the mouth texture. Select the mouth material and repeat the previously mentioned steps like so. There we go. Our Eevee is now fully shiny, and we didn't even need to go through the crazy odds to get one either. However, if we zoom in a bit on the model, you may notice that a lot of the texture detail is looking a bit blurry. This is the result of the somewhat low pixel resolution of these textures, and while you may not notice the blurriness in a zoomed out render, it may be a good idea to upscale the textures if you plan on doing any close-up shots. Thankfully, there's an online tool that makes upscaling these kind of textures pretty easy. Outside of Blender, let's go to our search engine and search up Waifu 2x. Yes, that is the actual name. When you do so, you should see a link that looks like this, with this URL. You'll want to click this link to enter the Waifu 2x site. I will also post a link to this site in the description. Once you're on the site, you should see a few options placed in front of you. The first option will ask you what file you would like to upscale, which will be one of our Pokemon image textures. So let's click this button here and navigate our computer to Eevee's Shiny Textures folder. From there, select one of the main color textures, like this body texture, and upload it to the site. The style and noise reduction settings can usually be left at their default values. The important thing is that you switch this upscaling setting to ×2 instead of ×1. This will upscale the texture to twice its normal size, while smoothing out some of the texture's features. Now all you need to do is confirm that you're not a robot, and press the download button. Sometimes the site may have you take one of those robot tests, but as long as you are, in fact, not a robot, you should be good. In addition, sometimes the downloading process may take a little bit to complete, but just be patient, and the upscaled texture should download to your computer in due time. Alright, that's one texture down. Now let's repeat the process for the other textures in the folder, like the eyes. In order to save time, I usually only upscale the textures that I plan on applying to the model, namely the default color textures. You can take the time to upscale all of these textures if you want, but most of the time you will probably find yourself only using the ones that look like this, so keep that in mind. Our settings are still in place from last time, so let's let the site know we're not a robot, complete one of those tests, and then press the download button again. While this upscaled eye texture is downloading, let's put in our mouth texture and repeat the process once again. Our downloads are complete and resting in our downloads folder. I'm going to take these textures and put them on our desktop for the time being, just so we can get a better look at them while we're doing some organizing. Let's navigate back to our Eevee folder and create a new folder within it called Images, Shiny, High Res. Now, move these new High Res Shiny textures into the Shiny High Res folder, and enter the folder yourself. If you haven't already noticed, the name of these textures are a little garbled, so let's fix that. Open up your original Images Shiny folder, and highlight the name of one of the original Shiny textures. Copy this name with either Ctrl-Command-C, and then highlight the name of the corresponding texture in the High Res folder. Press Ctrl-Command-V to replace this garbled name with the name of the original texture, and then add the word High Res to the end of it. Repeat this process with the other two textures. Now that these new, high-res textures are in place, let's head back into Blender. Back in Blender, let's get to applying these high-res textures to the model. The process is pretty much the same as applying the regular shiny textures from before. Select the body material from the material list, and then click the folder icon on the image texture node. Backstep to the Eevee folder by deleting this part of the file path, and then enter the images shiny high-res folder. Now select your upscaled body texture and open it. You may not notice any immediate differences, but let's repeat this process for the other materials and see what we think then. If you look at the face now, specifically the borders around the mouth, eyes, and nose, you will see that the edges are a lot more defined and a lot less blurry than before. This will certainly make your close-ups look a lot nicer. And guess what? If you take your high-res textures and run them through Waifu2X again, you can get textures with an even higher pixel resolution. So that's neat. From this point forward, the models you will be seeing in these tutorials will have their textures upscaled by 4 times. But keep in mind that upscaling your textures is not a necessary step in getting anything from this point forward to work. Upscaling textures is just a nice little way for your Pokemon to stick out a little bit more. And should you not want to worry about it, then you don't have to. Anyways, let's put these new textures to good use. How about we make a profile picture? Turn the armature's visibility back on using the outliner, and then select it. Enter pose mode by pressing Ctrl-Tab, press A to select every bone, and then go to Pose, Clear Transformation, All. Now go back into object mode, go to View, Cameras, Active Camera, to view the scene from our camera, and then change the camera's resolution to 400 by 400 in the output properties. Select the rim of the camera in your camera view to select the whole camera, and then press the G key to move it around. Pressing G, Z, Z will allow you to move the camera on its local Z axis, which should allow you to move it closer to the model. Now just make a few smaller position adjustments, select the armature, enter pose mode, and adjust Eevee's pose to your liking. When you're done, go back into object mode and hide the armature again. Now that Eevee's face is primed for a picture, how about I teach you how to change its facial expressions? Let's start with the mouth. Select the model, go into the materials properties, and make sure your mouth material is selected. Take a look at the nodes we have in the shader editor. In order to change Eevee's face, we're going to need to add 2 more nodes to the setup, and connect them back to the image texture node. For our first node, go to Add, Vector, Mapping, and then place the mapping node behind the image texture node. Once your mapping node is in place, connect its vector slot to the back of the image texture node. This will make Eevee's mouth look super weird, but don't panic, this will be fixed once we re-add the UV data during our next step. Press Shift A in the shader editor to add another node, and go to Input, Texture Coordinate. Place this behind the mapping node. Connect the texture coordinates UV slot to the vector slot of the mapping node, and Eevee's mouth should return to normal. Now, our node setup should look something like this. In order to demonstrate how these new nodes can move the mouth, I think it may be good to provide you with a visual representation of the mouth texture itself. This part usually isn't necessary, but it will help you in understanding how this all works. I'm going to right-click this edge, click Horizontal Split, and drag this line to the middle of our window to split it in 2. I'll then change this top window from the shader editor to a UV editor. Clicking this button will allow us to display any texture Blender currently has in its memory, like the ones on our model. So let's select Eevee's mouth texture. As you can see, this texture has Eevee's different mouths divided into separate boxes, but only the top leftmost mouth is being displayed. Why is that? Well, if we tab into Edit mode, deselect all of Eevee's vertices, and then use the material slot to solely select the vertices for Eevee's mouth material, you will see this weird box-shaped thing floating above the mouth texture. This is the UV map that dictates how the texture will be displayed on our selected vertices. And if we press the A key to select all of the points in this UV map, and G to move it around, you will notice that the visuals around Eevee's mouth will change depending on where we drag it. You may be able to see where we're going with this, but why is this map all the way up here and not in front of the texture? Well, a lot of Pokemon tend to have their UV maps placed high above the texture like this. But since these textures are technically repeating infinitely in this space, and the map is technically still in a spot that lines up with the top left mouth, we don't really notice much of a difference. Still, it may be a good idea to move this map back down in front of the texture by dragging it down manually, or better yet, pressing G, Y, -1 over and over to move it down in exact, precise steps until it reaches the texture like so. Doing this for the other materials will also help you should you choose to turn the repeating properties of these textures off for whatever reason, but that won't be something I'll cover in this tutorial. Anyway, with the UV map lined up with the texture, we have a pretty good idea of what's going on here. Whatever is displayed in this UV island is what will be displayed on the model. But what does this have to do with our node setup? Wouldn't it just be easier to change the mouth by moving this island around? We could do that, but it will help you a lot more in the long run if you learn to do so with this mapping node instead. By adjusting the location values on this mapping node, we can effectively offset the location of this box in the node editor, and have it display another part of the texture instead of this default mouth on the top left. For example, if we adjust the X values, the mouth will move in a horizontal motion across the texture, and if we adjust the Y values, it'll change in a vertical motion. Doing it this way will allow you to keyframe the position of your mouth for animations, something that we'll cover in our animation tutorial. The question now becomes, what values should we put in here to get certain mouths? If we think about this mathematically, putting a value of 1 in either the X or Y bar will cause the entire texture to loop around once. As such, the values we want to put in here should be fractions of 1, particularly in halves for the X value and in quarters for the Y value, as the texture is divided into 2 boxes horizontally and 4 boxes vertically. So for example, if we put negative 0.5 into the X bar, we will move our map exactly 1 space horizontally, which will give us this slightly shocked expression. But if we put negative 0.25 into the Y bar, we will get this slight smile, as negative 0.25 is a quarter of this texture's vertical length, and as such, we'll move our map exactly 1 space down. If we put both of these values in at the same time, we will get this slightly serious mouth, as the X value offset the map by 1 space horizontally, and the Y value offset the map by 1 space down. Simply put, starting from the top left, add negative 0.5 into the X bar to move 1 mouth horizontally, and add negative 0.25 into the Y bar to move 1 mouth down. Combine and add these values as needed to get the texture that you want. For this render, I want to use this wide open mouth, so I'm going to put negative 0.5 into the Y bar, as negative 0.5 is negative 0.25 doubled, and that will move our mouth down 2 spaces. With the mouth done, let's now move on to the eyes. Go ahead and select the eye material from the material list. We'll need to add this mapping and texture coordinate setup to our eye material, but there's actually a secret trick we can use to add them even faster. To do so, we'll need to enable it in our preferences though, so go up to Edit, Preferences. This will give us a crud ton of options to customize pretty much anything about Blender. But let's focus on the add-on section for now. Make sure the Enabled Add-ons Only button is turned off, and then type in Node in the search bar. You should see something labeled Node Wrangler. Enable the checkbox next to it, and exit out of the Preferences menu. From now on, if you select the Image Texture node and press Ctrl-T, Blender will automatically add and connect both the mapping node and the texture coordinate node itself, which is pretty neat. Let's now switch over to the UV image editor, display our eye texture, select our eye vertices in edit mode, and move our UV island down in front of the texture. Remember that the mapping node will usually work fine even if you don't make any adjustments in the UV image editor. From here, adjusting the eyes should work the exact same way as it does for the mouth. So if we want Eevee's eyes to be closed, then we'll need to move the map down 2 spaces by putting negative 0.5 in the Y bar. If we want Eevee's eyes to be sad, then we need to move the map 2 spaces down and 1 space horizontally. This can be done by putting negative 0.5 in the X bar, which will move us over to these angry eyes, and then negative 0.5 in the Y bar. A sad Eevee is very sad though. So how about we make it a happy Eevee instead? Move the map back up by 1 space by changing the negative 0.5 in the Y bar to negative 0.25, and we'll have happy Eevee eyes. Much better. Now something you may have noticed is that both of these eyes move in sync with one another. And while that's okay for a lot of renders, what if we want to control each eye individually for things like wings? Setting this up will require us to add a new eye material to our material list, and make some adjustments in edit mode. But before we do that, let's make some adjustments to our node setup in the shader editor. Select the texture coordinate node and pull it away from the other nodes a little bit. Then select the mapping node, press Shift D to duplicate it, and place the duplicated mapping node over the line connecting the first mapping node and the texture coordinate node together. This should automatically link this new mapping node in between them. Now with our new mapping node, and only our new mapping node selected, press Ctrl G. This will bring us to this weird green space, and in here, you'll want to disconnect the location, rotation, and scale lines from the back of the mapping node. With that done, you may be wondering, where the heck are we? And more importantly, how can we get back to our normal shader editor? Well, if you press the Tab key on your keyboard, we can switch back and forth between this green space and the normal shader editor. And if you look closely at the normal shader editor, you will notice that there's this green node called Node Group, where our mapping node once was. In reality, what we did when we pressed Ctrl G on the mapping node is create a new node group and placed our mapping node inside of it. That green space we were in before is what the inside of that node group looks like. Selecting the node group and pressing the Tab key is what allows us to enter and exit the node group at will, which will allow us to make adjustments as necessary. We probably don't want to keep this node group's name as node group, though. So let's use this box to rename it to Eevee Master Eye Control. The significance of this name will become apparent in a bit. In the meantime, if you try adjusting these location bars on the node group, you will notice that this isn't causing Eevee's eyes to move. This isn't a glitch, as this was caused by us disconnecting the location, rotation, and scale lines inside the node group earlier. It's also what we want for our setup. That said, we're going to want to remove these bars so that we don't get confused later on. So select the node group and press Tab to enter it. From here, click this arrow in the top right corner and look under the list of inputs. We don't want these location, rotation, or scale inputs. So let's select and delete them one at a time using this X button. Keep the vector input around. Now if we tab out of our node group, it should look something like this. Position the nodes a bit closer to each other like so, and we should finally be ready to add the second eye material. Go to your material list and press this plus button to add a new material slot. Then click this button to bring up the materials Blender has saved in its memory, and click the eye material. We should now have our eye material listed twice in the material list. Click these two pieces of paper here to convert this material into its own separate entity, and rename it to Eevee RI Matte. You will also want to rename the original eye material to Eevee LI Matte, and use these arrows to position the two materials close to each other on the list. Now comes the tricky part. You may want to save before you try this, as it could cause some mapping problems on your model should it be done incorrectly. Tab into edit mode, and if the eye vertices aren't already selected on your model, select them using the left eye material, or whatever your original eye material was. Position your view at the top of the model, and then press this button so you can see all of your model's topology at once. Press the B key to go into box select, hold shift, and create a box over all of the highlighted parts of the left eye. This should deselect them, but you'll want to double check to make sure that there isn't a face, edge, or vertex selected on the left eye. Not a single one. Once you've double checked, select the RI material from the material list and press the Assign button. Now the RI material dictates the appearance of the right eye, and the LI material is left dictating the appearance of the left eye. With this in place, the mapping node in each of our eye materials should only control their corresponding eyes, which will allow us to make things like wings. That said, what if we still want to control both eyes at once without having to switch back and forth between materials? Well, guess what, viewer? That's what that node group was for. If we enter our node group in any of our two eye materials and adjust the mapping node within, we can maintain our ability to control both eyes at once. Hence the name Eevee Master Eye Control. It doesn't matter if you enter the group from the left or the right eye. As long as you are within this node group, adjusting this mapping node will control both eyes at once. But with that, we're pretty much done with our texture setup. All we need to do now is make some final preparations to render our profile picture. I'm going to have Eevee wink at the camera using its left eye, re-enable our background plane in the outliner, turn our shader editor back into a 3D view for our camera, and enable rendered view. I'm also going to give our background plane a material and change its color to something other than white, just to help Shiny Eevee stand out a bit more from the background. Once everything looks good, go to Render, Render Image, and bask in the glory of your winking Pokemon character. If you still have that denoise node in place inside your compositor from my previous tutorial, most of the noise in your image should be gone. But just in case you forgot, here's what the node setup looks like again. Now just save your render to your computer and upload it to your favorite social media site. Congrats for learning about Pokemon textures and finishing your outstanding profile picture. This concludes the first part of this tutorial. The rest of this video will be focused on addressing a common problem that plagues the eye textures of quite a few Pokemon models. Something that looks like this. If you wish to know how to fix this problem, then please, continue watching. Otherwise, if your model's looking good, and you don't have this problem, then feel free to sign off here. Either way, thanks for watching. In my next tutorial, I'll show you how I personally optimize my Pokemon rigs, from adding IK constraints that prevent a model's legs from going through the floor, to grouping each bone's function by color and visibility. So I set up a Zorua model using a lot of the steps I mentioned in my previous tutorial, and I'm almost ready to render. The only problem is, of course, these weird looking eyes. This is a problem that quite a few Pokemon models face, and when you're first starting out, importing a model with this problem can be quite demotivating. However, once you're finished with this part of the tutorial, you will not only learn how to fix this problem, but you will be hoping to run into more models with this problem. As crazy as that sounds, just stick with me and you'll understand why that is. There are actually many different ways you could go about fixing this problem, and I myself have changed how I've gone about tackling the problem many times throughout the years. However, in order to keep things relatively condensed, I'm going to show you two different methods that I believe will give you the best outcome in most circumstances. Method 1 is super short, super simple, and can be done solely within Blender. However, it offers you less customization in your expressions, as you won't be able to move your model's irises around. You'll see what I'm talking about a bit later. Method 2 will allow you to move your model's irises around, but it takes a bit longer to set up, and it requires the use of an external image program like GIMP. We'll start with Method 1, and if you've been attentive to the textures in your folder, then you may have already figured this one out. First off, select your model, go into the material list, and select your model's iris material, which is the name I gave for the material that's assigned to this black mask thing. Remember that your materials will usually have different names from what I'm displaying here when you first import them, so keep that in mind. If you're confused on whether or not you have the right material selected, open up this preview, and the iris material should look something like this, as opposed to the eye material, which looks like this. With the iris material selected, tab into edit mode, and select the iris material's vertices. Our setup isn't going to require dedicated faces for the iris, so we can delete these vertices with the X key. We can also tab out of edit mode and use this minus button to remove the iris material from our material list. Again, we won't be needing this for our setup, so it's fine. You may have noticed that your model's eyes are now blank, like some kind of zombie, but we'll be fixing this in due time. Select your eye material and open up the shader editor. We're going to want to replace the image texture for our eye material, so click the folder icon in the image texture node. What you're seeing now is a folder of the textures that I upscaled for Zorua, but whether or not you choose to upscale your model's textures or not, you should see a texture somewhere among the others that is labeled I1 Merge. You'll want to select and open this texture. And look at that, Zorua's eyes are back to normal. Now we can add a mapping and texture coordinate node with Ctrl-T, and use the mapping node to change the model's expressions, just like any other model. A super quick and simple setup. However, if you want to see how we can make the irises movable, then stick around as I showcase Method 2. For Method 2, follow the same steps as Method 1 until you reach the shader editor. Skip the step where you replace the image texture and press Ctrl-T on the image texture node to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Pull all three of these nodes away from the principled BSTF node, and then duplicate them 2 times using Shift-D. This is where we're going to need to use our external image editor to edit some new textures for us to use. So I recommend saving and closing Blender for the time being. For this section, you can basically use any image editor you want, such as Photoshop, but I will be using GIMP for this tutorial, as GIMP is a free software just like Blender is, and will probably be more accessible to the majority of you. To download GIMP, go to your search engine and type in gimp.org. I'll put a link to their site in the description as well. From the home page, click here to enter the download page. You will get the option to download GIMP via BitTorrent or to download it directly. I would personally recommend downloading it directly. So from here, Download GIMP and install it on your computer, and we'll continue from inside the program. Welcome to GIMP. If you're just starting out, it's possible that you may have the windows separated apart like this. If you would prefer to have everything under a single window, then you can go up to Window, Single Window Mode, and that will fix things up for you. This isn't necessary by any means, but I thought I would share it for those of you who would prefer it. On to actual image editing, we're going to want to open up a texture in the program. So go up to File, Open. This will give you a file menu quite similar to Blender's, and just like Blender's, you can use it to navigate to your Pokemon's texture folder. Once you get there, open up the default eye texture, which is the eye texture without any irises. Your image should now be open and displayed in GIMP, with the associated image layer being spawned along with it over here in the Layers panel. Right-click this image layer and select Add Alpha Channel. This will allow parts of our image to be transparent, which will be important later on. Our ultimate mission for this texture is to remove the white part of these eyes and fill them with transparency instead. In order to do this, we're going to need to select all of these white parts though, and that can be done by going up to this magic wand looking icon, right-clicking it, and switching from Fuzzy Select to Select by Color. You'll also want to go down here and press this button so that the tool adds to our current selection. That way we can create a selection by sampling multiple points. With tool in hand, let's left-click inside the white part of the eyes. You should now see these little dots marching around the white spots. This dictates our current selection, which will lock most alterations that we can make inside of the specific area. The selection isn't perfect though, as there's still some white areas that are outside of our walking ants. So let's press the Z key to switch to our zoom tool, left-click to zoom into our eyes, and switch back to the color select tool. Click a few parts near the rim of the eye, and you should get a selection that's much more refined, which is what we want. You can also click and drag to expand our selection to the point where we want it to be, and while this can be useful, it can also come with some risk from my experience. To showcase what I mean, let's press Z to switch back to our zoom tool, and then Control and left click to zoom out. If we go to Edit, Cut, after doing this drag select, it's possible that you'll see some transparency come through the parts of the texture where the main body is, which isn't what we want. If this happens to you, press Ctrl-Command-Z to undo, go to Select, None, and start the process over again. Again, from my experience, clicking around the edge of the eyes rather than drag selecting typically prevents the body from becoming transparent, so that's what I would recommend doing. Once you've got a nice selection around the inside of the eyes, and have double-checked for out-of-place selections, zoom out, and press Ctrl-Command-X to cut the white part of the texture. This will make the eyes hollow with a checkered pattern, which is good. Before we do anything else though, go up to Edit, Paste As, New Layer in Place. This will bring the white parts back, but unlike before, these white parts will now be on a different layer, meaning we can move and adjust the white parts of our eyes separately from the hollowed out eye texture, and more importantly, toggle the display of each of them on and off. Click the eyeball next to our hollowed out eye texture in the Layers panel so that only the white part of the eyes remain on our canvas. We want to export these eye backgrounds as a new image, so go to File, Export As, and double check that you are in the folder that you want to be exporting to. Using this bar up here, rename this texture to Eye1 Background, and then export it like so. Now, disable the view of the eye backgrounds in the Layer panel, and enable the view of the hollowed out eye texture. You'll also want to make sure that your hollowed out eye texture is selected here, otherwise you may find that the adjustments we'll be making won't be doing anything. Granted you haven't removed it, the hollowed out parts of our eyes should still be selected. With the selection still in place, go to Select, Grow. GIMP will then ask you how much you want to expand your selection by. 1 is usually good, so keep it at 1 and press OK. It may not be much, but our selection is now 1 pixel wider on all sides, which will be important for our next step. Go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur. This will give us a blur menu, which will let us adjust our blur in a wide variety of ways. The only thing we care about is the XY size though. Set both of these values to 1 or 1.5 and press OK. This blurs the inner rim of our eyes slightly, which may not seem like a big deal, but it's important for helping our final setup in Blender look less stiff and pixelated. With this done, go to File, Export As, add the word Alphaless to your texture's name, and export it to your desired location. That's 2 out of the 3 textures we need done now. We don't need to edit this texture any further, so we can close it using this X button here. Instead, let's open a new texture, this time the merged version of the eyes. Once this texture has been opened, go back up to File and click Open as Layers. Open the model's iris texture. This will open our transparent iris texture as a separate layer from our merged eye texture, and using this Move tool, we can move it around independently. We're going to want to line this iris up with the irises on the top left eyes of our merged eye texture. So set the iris's layer's opacity to 50% using the bar above the layer panel, so we can align things more closely, and then line the 2 irises up as close as you can. Once it's in a good spot, right-click your iris layer in the Layers panel, and select Duplicate Layer, which will create an exact duplicate of your iris on another layer. With this new iris layer selected, go to Layer, Transform, Flip horizontally. Align this flipped iris with the other eye, disable the merged texture from view, and set both irises' opacity back to 100. What you're looking at now is our third and final texture. You know the drill. File, Export As, and rename the texture to Iris Pair, and then export. While not always necessary, it may also be a good idea to render out each of these irises separately as well, as it could help you overcome a very small hurdle that some models have. Again, not always necessary, but it's probably good to have. If you decide to do so, rename the texture with the iris on your right side with an L, and the one on your left side with an R. With that, we're finally done with GIMP, so let's head back into Blender. Good to be back in familiar waters, isn't it? With our new textures in hand, let's go about assigning them to each of these image texture nodes. On the top one, open up your Alphaless texture. On the middle one, open up your background texture. This will cause your eyes to look a little bit funny, but it won't stay like that forever. And finally, on the bottom one, open up your iris pair texture. Now here comes the interesting part where we mix all 3 of these textures together. Press Shift A to add a new node, and go to Color, Mix RGB. Place it in front of the bottom image texture node. Connect the nodes together like so. Once that's done, take the color slot of the middle image texture node and connect it to the color 1 slot of the Mix RGB node. Duplicate the Mix RGB node with Shift D and place it in the path behind the principled BSDF node. Connect the first RGB node to the bottom slot of the second, and the color slot of the top image texture node to the color 1 slot. Press Shift A, Color, Invert to add an invert node to your setup, and run the top image texture's alpha slot into the color slot of the invert node. Remember, color slot. All you need to do now is connect the invert node to the factor slot, and all should be good. The eyes should be looking as they should. However, if you go down to this bottom mapping node and try adjusting the location bars, you'll notice some fast flickering. Hold down the Shift key while doing the same thing to make your adjustments more precise, and you'll see magic. All that extra work has allowed us to adjust the individual irises of our eyes, which will allow our model to display a whole lot more personality than it otherwise would. That said, our nodes could use a little bit of cleaning up, so let's do that. Delete the top and bottom texture coordinate nodes and the top mapping node. Instead of having a mapping node and texture coordinate node for each texture, we can connect our middle mapping node to the top and middle image texture nodes and our single texture coordinate node to both of the mapping nodes. This simplifies our setup. Adjust the irises with the bottom mapping node and control the eyes with the top. Relatively easy to use. The million-dollar question is now, can we control both irises individually? The answer is yes. Yes, we can. Similar to the setup I showed with Eevee during the main tutorial, you'll want to duplicate both the mapping nodes and place them in their respective paths between the texture coordinate node. We'll then want to put each of these new mapping nodes into their own node groups. Let's start with the top one. Select the mapping node, press Ctrl G, and disconnect the lock-rock scale lines. Open this window and remove the lock-rock scale inputs as well. Name the top node group Zorua Master Eye Control. Repeat this process for the bottom mapping node as well, only this time name the node group Zorua Master Iris Control. From this point, setting up the individual left and right eye materials is pretty much the same as it is for any other model. Add a new material slot, fill it in with your eye material, make the eye material in this slot a separate entity, rename the two materials R and LI respectively, enter edit mode with your model, highlight the original eye material's vertices, deselect the vertices surrounding the left eye with shift box select, assign the vertices surrounding the right eye to the right eye material, and you should be good to go. You should now be able to control the irises individually using their respective mapping nodes, and both at the same time using the node group. And of course, the same applies for the eyelids as well. A few quick notes before we finish up. First off, if you're moving your iris around and you know something like this happening when you're moving your iris too far from its origin point, that is due to the space between your two irises in your iris pair texture, and can be fixed by assigning the right iris texture to the bottom image texture node of your right iris material, and the left iris texture to the bottom image texture node of your left iris material. Second, if you're using a sword and shield model, the textures you need for the setup should be available by default, without the use of GIMP. The only difference is that the background and iris textures will usually be combined into one, so your final texture setup should look more like this, only requiring the use of 2 image texture nodes and 1 mix RGB node to combine things together. Enough talk though, let's use our setup to create a cool Zorua profile picture. I'll turn the display of our background plane and armature back on, and make a few adjustments to Zorua's position towards the camera, namely rotating it to the side slightly. I'll then use this master iris control node group to have the irises face the camera from this new position. The right iris seems to be a little closer to the eyelid than I would want it to be though, so I'll head over to the right iris material and use its mapping node to readjust it to the right spot. There we go. I'll now just make a few more adjustments with the camera and we'll be set to render. I hope these eye texture techniques will prove useful to you going forward. Good luck. Watch and complete this tutorial if you haven't already. Hide the plane in the model's armature. Open the shader editor. Select the body material and the materials properties. Delete these nodes. Take note of the texture's name in the image texture node. Click the folder icon and navigate to your model's image shiny folder. Import the texture that shares the same name as the texture that was displayed earlier, or with rare at the end of its name in the case of sword and shield models. Repeat this process for the other materials. Go to the Waifu2x website, link in the description. Upload one of your model's textures and set the upscaling to ×2. Prove you're not a robot. Download the upscaled image. Repeat this process for the rest of the model's color textures. Put your upscaled textures in their own folder. Run these textures through the website again to upscale your textures even higher. Back in Blender. Replace your textures with the upscaled ones. Set up your scene for a close-up of Eevee's face. Select your mouth material and enter the shader editor. Add a mapping node to the back of the image texture node. Add a texture coordinate node and place its UV slot into the mapping node's vector slot. If you enable Node Wrangler in Blender's add-on preferences, you can press Ctrl-T on your image texture node to do this automatically. Split open a new window and display the UV image editor. Load your mouth texture as reference. Tab into edit mode and select all the vertices on your mouth material. Select the UV island above your texture and press GY-1 multiple times until the UV island is overlapping the texture display. Use the mapping node's XY location bars to change the mouth texture. Add -0.5 to the X bar to move one mouth horizontally. Add -0.25 to the Y bar to move one mouth down. Add and combine these values to get your desired mouth. The same principle applies for the eyes. Duplicate your mapping node and place it in between the first mapping node and the texture coordinate node. Select the new mapping node and press Ctrl-G to put it into a new node group. Disconnect the lock rock scale lines. Go here and remove the lock rock scale inputs. Leave vector alone. Press tab to exit node group. Rename node group to Eevee Master Eye Control. Add a new material slot and fill it with your eye material from this list. Press this button to create a new material from this eye material. Rename the new eye material RI and the old one LI. Tab into edit mode and highlight your model's vertices using the original eye material. Press this button to see all of your model's topology at once. Deselect the model's left eye vertices by pressing B to enter box select and holding shift while boxing around the left eye. Double check to make sure you got all of the left eye vertices deselected. Only the right eye vertices should be selected now. Assign right eye vertices to the right eye material. Mapping node in the left eye material will now only control the left eye, vice versa for the right eye. Tabbing into the master eye control node group from either material will allow you to control both at the same time as usual. Render your desired facial expression. Tab into edit mode with the model that has this problem. Select your iris material and highlight its vertices. This material should look something like this. Delete the iris vertices from your model. Select the eye material and enter the shader editor. Use the image texture node to replace the regular eye texture with the merge eye texture. Control eye textures as normal. Repeat the previous steps until you reach the shader editor. Add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Duplicate the texture coordinate node, mapping node, and image texture node twice. Go to GIMP.org and download GIMP. Open GIMP. Open your regular eye texture without the irises. Add an alpha channel to your image layer. Use the select by color tool to select all of the white parts inside the eyes. Make sure nothing outside the eyes is selected. Edit, cut to cut the white part of the eyes out. Double check to make sure that other parts of your texture haven't become partially transparent. Edit, paste as, new layer in place to paste the white parts back in as a new layer. Disable the view of the hollowed out eye texture and export the white parts of the eyes as eye background. Disable the eye background layer and re-enable the view of the hollowed out eye texture. With a selection of your hollowed out eye texture in the layers panel and the hollowed out part of your eye is still selected in your canvas, go to select, grow, and increase the selection size by 1. After that, do filters, blur, Gaussian blur, and set the blur size to 1. Export the hollowed out eye texture as eye alphaless. Close the hollowed out eye texture and open the eye merged texture. File, open as layers to open the iris texture as a new layer. Line your iris layer up with the iris of the top left eye. Duplicate this iris, flip its layer horizontally, and line it up with the other eye. Disable the view of the merged texture and export the irises as iris pair. It may also be a good idea to export each of these irises individually as well. Name the standalone iris to your right L iris and the standalone iris to your left R iris. Back in Blender, alphaless texture to the top image texture node, background texture to the middle, iris pair texture to the bottom. Add a mix RGB node and connect the bottom two image texture nodes like so. Duplicate your mix RGB node and connect the nodes together like so. Add an invert node. Connect the alpha slot of the top image texture node to the color slot of the invert node. Connect the invert node to the factor. You can now control the irises using the bottom mapping node. Make sure you hold shift while doing so to adjust in small increments. The regular eyes can also be controlled with his top mapping node. Reorganize the left side of your node setup like this in order to keep things simpler. Duplicate both of your mapping nodes and place them behind the old ones. Put each of these mapping nodes into their own node groups. Disconnect the lock-rock scale lines and inputs in the process. Name the top node group Master Eye Control and the bottom Master Iris Control. Add a new material slot, fill it with your eye material, press this button to make this new eye material its own thing, and rename the eye materials Li and Ri. Tab into edit mode and use your original eye material to select the eye vertices on your model. Use shift box select to deselect the vertices covering your model's left eye and assign the vertices covering the right eye to the right eye material. Right eye material will now only control the right eye, left eye material will now only control left. Node groups control both at the same time. This applies for both eyes and irises. If you run into this problem while adjusting your iris's position and you want to fix it, replace the iris pair texture with the left iris and right iris textures respectively. Sword and Shield models have these type of textures by default without the use of GIMP. However, the iris pair and eye background textures are combined into one. As such, your final node setup using a Sword and Shield model will look more like this. Render your desired facial expression. Done.